Hello, ladies and gents. It's Justin Johnson. We're on the module A225 Ambition and Anxiety, edited by Paul Lawrence. I'm going to influence youth today, young teenagers, mature teenagers, young adults, OAPs. Many people go about their reading obsolence. They find reading obsolence. Their observation skills become obsolence. They get on with their day-to-day routine. We've got to be methodical in practice. We need to be methodical. Wake up, repeat, sleep, repeat. It's what a lot of adults find hard today. Is trying to stay with a steady practice. They lose concentration. Their mind tends to drift off somewhere else, social media, watching TV, checking their phone. Anyway, we've got a hot pen highlighter to highlight the words, big words that we might not know what they mean. Anyway, we're on Unit 6, Imagined Nations Made Real, page 260. Population here too, however, a shift towards English was evident by the mid-19th century, and the Scots Gaelic-speaking community declined to approximately 20% of the population by 1800. Virtually disappearing by the end of the 19th century, Jones and MacLeod, 2007. The reasons for this language decline are quite complex. The English language was the language of the state and become increasingly important to acquire for a range of purposes, including business and legal dealings. During the period, education was typically provided through the medium of English. And in some cases, the use of Celtic languages was actively discouraged. For instance, tally sticks were introduced in Irish classrooms in the 1830s. Each time a child spoke Irish, a notch was cut into the stick and the child was punished accordingly to the end of the day. Similarly, in Wales, a piece of wood or slate with NW or Welsh knot is hung around the neck of children who spoke Welsh in the classroom. Of course, the proliferation of English language printed material may have also played an important role in language decline. Few printed works were produced in the Scots Gaelic or Irish languages in the 18th and 19th centuries. It is likely that this reflected low levels of literacy and a small market for print in Gaelic speaking regions. However, for those who wish to acquire the skill of reading English language, printed material was simply easier to access and less expensive to buy than material produced in Irish and Scots Gaelic. While this may have contributed to the decline of the Gaelic languages, reading English language material had the potential to allow bilingual, literate Irish and Scottish people to imagine themselves to be part of a much wider community of readers. Dispersed throughout the British Isles, the situation in Wales was different. 9 out of 10 people in Wales were mono- monoglot Welsh speakers, and the overwhelming bulk of the printed material produced by domestic presses was in the Welsh language. Dixon, 2007. Furthermore, the Welsh language had developed a much stronger print culture than that of the Irish or Scots Gaelic. Part of the reason for this was the growth of Methodism in the late 18th century Wales. Fueling demand for the Welsh language religious texts, the emergence of industry, particularly in South Wales, also helped to create a larger market for Welsh language printed material, thereby facilitating the production of a greater variety of publications, including political cartoons and newspapers. O. Cuisine, 2004 to 6. Despite this, as you see in exercise 6.4, Welsh print output was much smaller than that of the other countries of the British Isles, in part reflecting the country's much smaller population. A variety of the English languages were also spoken in British Isles. These languages were very close related and, to an extent, mutually intelligible. The Scots language, the Scots English language is a good example of this. It was and is a language primarily spoken in southern or lowland areas of Scotland. In exercise 6.5, if we turn to reading 6.5, Robert Burns to a Mouse, 1785, located at the end of the unit, this is an extract from a poem written by Burns, whom you encountered in Unit 4. As you read the verses, try to make out the general meaning of the Scots-English composition. You will probably need to reread it several times before the verses begin to make sense. Reading aloud may help explanations for the words in bold are given at the end of the reading, but try not to refer to these unless you have to. How did you get on? The extract may seem daunting at first, but even if you are not familiar with certain words and phrases, you'll likely have been able to guess at the meaning of the most of it. I hope this exercise helped you to understand how it was possible to alliterate Scots English speaking to access and understand the English language printed material. Keeping that in mind, they were exposed to such material on a regular basis. We're going to have a little look at this. Turn to reading 6.5. We will have a little read this. I don't know what it is. It's further ahead. We'll look at it in a minute. Having read this section, you might well conclude that the English language was the national print language of the British Isles. The majority of people spoke the English language, and the overwhelming majority of printed publications were produced in English language. In theory, at least, it is possible that these printed publications helped people living in the British Isles to feel part of the wider community of English speakers, in turn promoting a shared sense of national identity. However, it is important to remember here that Anderson argues that national language communities formed only the embryo of nationality imagined communities. In other words, national print languages were a necessary but not sufficient condition for the emergence of national identity. To more fully understand the development of the national identity in the British Isles, it is necessary to take a range of other factors in account. Furthermore, you'll see that printed publications could convey a wide range of messages and therefore did not always serve to foster the idea that all the people living in the United Kingdom were part of one and the same nation. If we go to the module website complex activity 6.2, exploring British print culture, this should take around an hour. Page 263, Britons and Britishness. In this section, you explore the idea of British national identity to start off. I'd like you to consider the Gordon riots, which have been described as the worst outbreak of public disorder in 18th century Britain, Dixon, 2007. In 1780, a member of the British Parliament, Lord George Gordon, 1751 to 1793, began to stir up public support for repeal of the Catholic Relief Act of 1778, which had removed legislation that prevented Roman Catholics from joining the army. To achieve this aim, Gordon established a new society called the Protestant Association. This organisation quickly won a great deal of public support, and on the 2nd of June 1780, Gordon led a crowd of 40 to 60,000 people to the House of Commons to submit a petition calling for the repeal of the Act, Jones 2013, page 80. Details of that event and the rioting in London that ensued were reported in numerous pamphlets, newspapers, and monthly and annual periodicals. Exercise 6.6. If we turn to the reading 6.3, London Evening Post, 1st to the 3rd of June 1780, located at the end of the unit. This is an extract from newspaper report printed in London Evening Post, one of the most popular newspapers at the time. With a circulation of about 4,000 to 4,500, the report outlines the outbreak of anti-Catholic rioting in London. Remember that newspaper reports are not impartial. This exercise will help you to develop your abilities to recognise the bias and political sympathies of the author. I should point out that contemporaries frequently referred to the Roman Catholics as Papists and their religion as Popery, both terms derived from the title of the head of church. Papists and Popery. As you read the extract, jot down some bullet points and notes in response to the questions. What is the author's attitude to Roman Catholicism? Did you find it surprising? Who are the protesters described in the reading? What identities, religious, national, or otherwise, are attributed to them here? Are these identities compatible? This should take around 30 minutes. The author has a negative attitude towards Catholicism, claiming, for example, that popery threatens liberty and morals, and was born out of superstition and diabolical cruelty. The protesters are identified at the outset by their religion. There are Protestants defending their religious rights. There are some references to national identity here too, though a division of the Protestant Association is described as a Scotch resident in London, who were preceded by a bagpipe playing as they marched. Later in the extract, a quote from Prince William Henry, the Duke of Gloucestershire, 1743 to 1805, expressed his support for the cause of the Protestant religion and British liberty. Based on this article, we could conclude that the protesters are Protestant in religion. Residents of London, English and Scottish, British and anti-Catholic, all these identities appear to be entirely compatible with one another. Language used in a newspaper report to describe Roman Catholics is very negative. While this kind of language may seem surprising to modern readers, it was not at all unusual to find such sentiments expressed in English language publications from this period, from newspapers to the Book of Common Prayer. The notion that Roman Catholicism was superstitious in nature stemmed from the idea that Catholics held beliefs and engaged in religious practices that had no basis in the Bible. Various wars with France, a country led by an absolute monarch, over the course of the 17th and 18th centuries meant that Catholicism was also particularly associated with slavery, tyranny, and arbitrary power. As you'll gathered, the orderly procession of the House of Parliament to present the Protestant petition descended into rioting depicted in figure 6.6. The riot continued for a week, during which over 700 people are thought to have been killed. Although the violence was focused in London, anti-Catholic unrest was evident in other British cities too. In fact, reaction to relief legislation had been so strong in Scotland that the measure had not been imposed there. This poses an important question. Why had the government promoted Catholic relief legislation at a time when there was such a widespread public opposition to the measure? And what does this imply about the development of British national identity in the period of 18 to 1840? Britain Catholicism and Britishness. Since the 16th century, various laws had restricted the ability of people who did not conform to the established churches of Britain and Ireland to participate in civil, military, and political life. This was because if a person refused to conform to a religion of the state, their loyalty to the state was seen to be open to question. The terms dissenter or nonconformists were often used to describe people such as Roman Catholic and certain Protestant groups, including Baptists, Methodists, and Quakers, who fitted into this category. While dissenting Protestants were permitted greater involvement in political affairs as the 18th century progressed, Roman Catholics remained subject to a range of penal laws for much of the century. Dixon, 2007. Although the idea of discriminating against a group of people on the basis of their religion was becoming increasingly difficult to justify by the late 18th century, it was the need to recruit men in the British Armed Forces that proved to be driving force behind Catholic relief efforts at that time. Legislation had long been in place to prevent Catholic military service. In practice, however, thousands of Catholics from Scotland and Ireland had served in British armed conflicts, and by the 1770s there emerged a growing body of opinion that removing the laws that prevented them from doing so legally would encourage further recruitment in Coley 2003. was for this specific purpose that the first Catholic Relief Acts was passed in the Irish Parliament in 1774 and the British Parliament in 1778. So you can see that the first Catholic Relief Acts were promoted by British and Irish governments for quite practical reasons. As such, it is somewhat difficult to understand why this legislation caused such widespread and violent opposition, where the anti-Catholic protesters and rioters in London in 1780 simply religious zealots. They were out of touch with new, more tolerant attitudes towards religion. Or was there something more to their actions towards a definition of Britishness? Although anti-Catholic, although Catholic sentiment in Britain had deep roots, it has also been interpreted as an important manifestation of an emerging new British national identity in the late 18th and 19th, early 19th centuries. Leaving aside Ireland for the time being, Linda Coley 2003 has provided one of the most compelling descriptions of British national identity that emerged among people who live in England, Wales, and Scotland during this period. For Coley, British identity did not result from a blending or the integration and homogenization of disparate cultures, but was instead superimposed over a variety of regional and national identities. Coley 2003, page 6. In other words, Britishness was the identity that could exist alongside Welshness, Englishness, or Scottishness. Coley goes on to explain that war and religion provided common causes for people living in England, Wales, and Scotland during the periods successive wars against France, including the War of the Grand Alliance, 1688 to 97, the War of the Spanish Succession, 1702 to 13, the War of the Australian Succession, 1740 to 48, the 7 Years' War, 1756 to 1763, the American Revolutionary War, 1775 to 83, and the French Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars, 1793 to 1815, played a key role in the invention of British national identity. France was not only a threat to the state, it also seemed to represent everything that Britain was not until 1789, France, a Roman Catholic country governed by an absolute monarch. After the revolution, the country appeared to move too far in the opposite direction towards democracy and republicanism. In contrast to these extremes, Great Britain was a Protestant state with a Protestant people and Protestant monarch, and its constitution offered a balance of monarchical, aristocratic, and democratic government. Shared participation and success in war, trade, and empire bolstered this common sense of national identity among the people of England, Scotland, and Wales. Particularly as the success nation, Coley 2003, like Anson, see section 6.2. Coley sees the nation as a modern development and suggests that the press, as well as popular political movements, played an important role in spreading the idea of Britishness throughout the island of Great Britain. Coley 2003. You have noted the strong connection between Protestantism and Britishness of Coley's definition of national sentiment at this time. However, you might be wondering about the adherents of other faiths who lived within the boundaries of the state. Coley explains their position as follows. Self-evidently, the Protestant construction of British identity involved the unprivileging of minorities who would not conform to Protestantism. The Catholic community, most Highland, Scotland before 1745, and supporters of the exiled Stuart destiny, those men and women who were not allowed to be British so others would be. Coley 2003. This is a good example of an instance where the state and nation are not fully compatible. Although Catholics live within the boundaries of the state, they were not necessarily recognised as members of the British nation. With Coley's definition of a Protestant anti-Catholic form of Britishness in mind, think back to the rioters in London in 1780 for a moment. Do their nations make more sense? Certainly by introducing Catholic relief measures at a time when Britain was at war with France. The government could be seen to have been undermining what it meant to be British for a great number of people living in England, Scotland, and Wales. Catholic emancipation. Further relief acts were passed by the British Parliament in 1778 to 1782, but the major breakthrough came in 1793 when Irish Catholics were granted freedom of worship and admission to the most evil offices. Furthermore, Roman Catholic men in Ireland, who met the same qualifications as their Protestant counterparts, were readmitted to the franchise Dixon 99. Significant changes had been evident in Britain too, and in 1791 an extensive English Relief Act permitted Catholics to practice law and granted them the freedom to practice their religion without penalty. However, Catholics in Britain and Ireland could not yet sit in Parliament, and Catholics in Britain could not yet vote. Calls for Catholic emancipation. The provision of the full civil rights for Catholics gathered pace in the early 19th century, but widespread public opposition remained evident across Britain. Societies such as the Protestant Brunswick clubs were established to organise opposition. Mass meetings were held for England, Scotland, and Wales, and hundreds of petitions were submitted to Parliament urging MPs to reject the Catholic claims. To some degree, this no property movement may have reflected British anxieties surrounding the recent influx of Irish immigrants into the country, the result of an economic slump in the wake of the Napoleonic Wars. Reports of the popular movement in favour of Catholic emancipation underway in Ireland also fed into escalating British opposition to the measure. However, Coley asserts that such factors do not fully explain the scale of movement against Catholic emancipation in Britain. Instead, she points to evidence indicative of a strong sense of British identity among supporters of the movement, and argues that these people saw themselves quite consciously as being part of the native tradition of resistance to Catholicism, which stretched back for centuries and which seemed indeed to be timeless. Coley 2003. Turn to reading 6.4. Catholic Emancipation, third letter to the people of Wales. 16th October 1828, located in this unit. This is an extract from a Welsh newspaper of the period. Don't be surprised if you encounter a few unfamiliar terms. This is common with historical primary sources. Just refer to a dictionary to clarify any terms you don't recognise. Read the extract carefully and then answer the following question. What evidence do you find in this reading to support Coley's view that there was a strong sense of British identity among no property campaigners? In this extract, the author addresses readers as ancient Britons and so seems to be speaking to the fellow nationals. The author also makes references to the Protestant Reformation and discusses the threat posed by Roman Catholicism at some length, arguing that Catholics seek power and will not be satisfied until a favourable opportunity presents itself, of attempting the rescue of Great Britain out of the hands of Protestant heretics. Coley suggests that anti-Catholic sentiment was a feature of Britishness, and there is evidence of that in this reading. At a glance, it will certainly seem as though the author is invoking a sense of British national identity that stretched back for centuries. However, some Welsh people saw themselves as descendants of the original settlers of the British Isle, the ancient Britons, so this article can also be seen as an appeal to the Welsh people specifically rather than Britons in general. Although there was a significant campaign against Catholic emancipation, the cause was not without its advocates in Britain. For instance, Parliament received many petitions in favour of the measure from all over the island, and certain printed publications also promoted it. It is also worth noting that appeals to British national sentiment were not the exclusive domain of those who harboured anti-Catholic sentiment. To give just one, during these debates on the issue, in in the House of Commons, Ralph Leicester, 1764 to 1835, an MP from Shaftesbury, argued that emancipation was a measure of justice, of policy, of charity. It was not an English measure, nor a Scottish measure, nor an Irish measure. It was a British measure. It was not a Protestant measure, nor a Popish measure. It was a Christian measure, quoted in Ditchfield 2003. You can see here that appeals to the idea of Britons and Britishness could be used by both sides and add a sense of legitimacy to all their claims.